Today I am showing you a Sky Striker budget list, and right after that I will show you what upgrades you can do to make it even better. So as always in these videos, I first start off with a list that has as many free-to-play friendly cards as possible. Now I will say I am aware you can make a really solid competitive deck with a lot of ultras and so forth free to play already. However, these gems do dry up, and people are really starting to notice that now. You know, 1 week into the game, a lot of people are like, damn, I made my one deck or I made 2 decks, and now, you know, the gems are kinda gone and I can't make any more decks. That's what makes these budget guides so great. You are able to check out my older guides like Eldritch and PK and so forth, and you can try out an archetype even if you don't have that many materials. And then if you really do like it, you can upgrade it over time. So the same way here, again, if you have a bunch of other staples, you can absolutely put these in, and again we'll be going over these bigger upgrades later in the video, but this is like the bare bones. So first of all, I do have to say, I'm not sure why I have the 1 Max C here. Honestly, if you don't have a Max C, just play the 3rd Chalice just like that, but I do have to say, Max C is absolutely incredible. So that would, in my opinion, be the first craft you make. So let's get into the actual list. First of all, we have our Ash Blossom. I hope by now everyone knows Ash Blossom is incredible, and also you get it for free. You know, if you followed my guide, you got your 1 free Ash Blossom, so it's in the deck. It's probably in every list ever. It's generic, it's great. Next we have Ray. This is basically the normal summon in the deck. This is the card that a lot of your plays start from. She is basically gonna turn into other Sky Striker Link monsters by herself, and that's why she's at 3 in the deck. So as you can read, quick effect, you can tribute this card, special summon 1 Sky Striker Ace monster from your extra deck to the extra monster zone. While this card is in your graveyard, if a face-up Sky Striker Ace Link monster you control is destroyed by battle or leaves the field because of an opponent's card effect, you can special summon this card. So this has a lot of little things you can do right. First of all, the fact that this is a quick effect is really good, because if someone targets your Ray, you can quickly link it off into something else, and so you can end the board with a Ray, and your opponent is gonna waste something on that Ray just for you to then special summon something else anyway. But you don't have to. You can also already link it off into a Link monster on your own turn to then start doing a bunch of plays. If you have a Sky Striker Link monster in your opponent's turn and they kill it, let's say they attack into it or whatever, now you suddenly get a Ray back, and if it was in the battle phase, cool, you're probably not getting OTK'd. And again, if it was during the main phase, now they have one more thing to deal with before they can try and kill you, if they can. So it's a very versatile card, a definite must at 3. Next we have Rose. Rose is our other Sky Striker monster. Basically, if another Sky Striker monster is normal or special summoned, you can special summon this card from your hand. If an opponent's monster in the extra monster zone is destroyed by battle or leaves the field because of your card effect while this is in the graveyard, you can special summon this card. Then you can negate the effects of 1 face-up monster your opponent controls until the end of this turn. You will notice this deck has a lot of little cards that interact with your opponent, and so being able to have that on top is really solid. Now it does have to be in the extra monster zone, so because certain decks don't rely on that as much as back in the day, this part of the skill did get a bit weakened, but it still comes up often. Usually people run like 2 rows, but because this is a budget deck, we are playing the 3 instead, because it is definitely a solid card, and definitely more solid than some of the other budget things we have. I do need to give this disclaimer. This is probably the hardest deck to make budget, because it relies heavily on the big amount of hand traps it is able to play, as well as other ultra rares in this game that make it compete. Basically, Sky Striker is like a very lean engine of very impactful cards, but the payoff for that is that you can play a lot of other impactful cards on top. So if you're making this deck budget, you're basically diluting the amount of impactful cards you have access to. So you will notice when we go into the heavier upgraded list, we will go from these few ultras to a crap ton of ultras. It is definitely the least budget friendly out of the videos that I'm making, you know, in this series. So next we have the Raigeki, just an impactful ultra rare that we got for free, and also it's a spell. It is pretty important to note that Sky Striker cards become more powerful the more spells you have in your graveyard. Most of the cards really say if you have 3 in your graveyard, then do something extra. Like if you read Engage, she gets a free draw if you have 3. You read Afterburner, you get to destroy a spell or trap if you have 3. Here you can destroy a monster if you have 3, and so forth. Well, 3 or more, of course. So a lot of these cards get better the more spells you have in your graveyard, and so this is just another spell. It's a really good, impactful one, but it's also adding to your spell count. Next we have Monster Reborn, just another impactful ultra that we got for free, and also it's a spell. We have Reinforcement of the Army, again impactful ultra, and all of our Sky Strikers are warriors, so you can surge them with the Rhoda if you need to. You got it for free, ups your spell count, incredible card for the deck. Then we have 3 Pot of Desire, so this is our first super that we have in this deck. Again, it is another spell, so it's gonna up that count, and it's also gonna draw you 2 cards, so really, really incredible. The worst feeling though is to banish your Engage. In the TCG you only have 1 Engage, so if you then Pot of Desires and you lose it, you're gonna cry. This is also why you don't really see a pure striker build in the TCG these days, because the 1 Engage makes it harder. With 2 Engage, you know, in this ban list it's much easier. So speaking of Engage, this is the card. This is the card, in my opinion, that makes strikers nuts. If you control no monsters in your main monster zone, add 1 Sky Striker card from your deck to your hand, except the Engage itself. Then if you have 3 or more spells in your graveyard, you can draw 1 card. So first of all, I need to clarify, main monster zone. This means the 5 zones that are not in the middle of the board. So you know you have your 5 zones and then you have 2 zones in the middle. You can have cards in the middle, meaning link monsters or extra deck monsters. You can have one there, but you can't have them behind that. So essentially how this deck is going to play, if you make any normal monster, let's say you have your Ray or a token that we already spoke of, you're going to link that off into a Sky Striker link monster that goes into that extra zone, you know, one of those 2. And now your main monster zone is empty again, so you can start getting all the value from these Sky Striker spells. So this one, again, you can activate it when your main monster zones are empty, so you can have that 1 link monster there, but not more than that. So then it adds any Sky Striker card from your deck to your hand. This is incredible already. We have so many Sky Striker cards with so many different effects that you might need depending on the situation. You can get out of many situations. This is also, by the way, why in this particular video I do not have a combo section. I'm sorry, because essentially it entirely depends on what your opponent is doing. This is not your typical combo deck. I don't have one combo I can show you that you will get a bunch of value from, because it all depends on what your opponent is doing. If your opponent has some crazy monster which you need to negate, Engage will look for a certain thing. If your opponent has a crazy spell or trap you need to get rid of, Engage will look for another thing. But so your turn 1 play is not, you know, your typical crazy combo, though there are of course combos you do and things you can set up, but understanding the fact that Sky Striker is not this, I'm gonna do a crazy thing on turn 1 by doing 20 things in a row, it's really important to understand. So again, you look for anything, and then after that, if you have 3 or more spells in your grave, which hopefully you do, then you draw a card. So this is a -1 because you play it, and then +2 back. That's a Pot of Greed right here, and not just any Pot of Greed. This is a Pot of Greed, but one of the cards is a Search. That is insanely good. I'm kind of sad this is at 1 in the TCG. I would love to play with this again, but at higher copies, of course. So this is the main card in the deck. This is the most important thing. Very often, if you are able to make a Kagari, but we'll get to that, she will add back something. You just add back that Engage and you just... oh, you start plussing so hard. Notice how this is not a hard once per turn. So a lot of cards in Yu-Gi-Oh say you can only use this card once per turn. And, you know, that's too bad for you. This one isn't like that. You can just use this over and over if you're able to recycle it. Next, we have Afterburner. So if you control no monsters in your main monster zone, target 1 face-up monster on the field, destroy it. Then, if you have 3 or more spells in your grave, you can destroy 1 spell or trap on the field. So like I said, if your opponent has some crazy monster that you can destroy, you can Engage to look for this. But maybe they don't, and then you might need something else. Also, since this can destroy a spell or trap on the field, if you don't like a skill drain or something like that, you know, Eldritch might be using that, Afterburners can get rid of that. that. So that's really solid. Next, we have one maneuver jamming waves. This says if you control no monsters in your main monster zone, so again, that's going to come up a lot in these spells. Target one set spell or trap on the field, destroy it. Then if you have 3 or more spells in your grave, you can destroy one monster on the field. So this is kind of the opposite of the Afterburners. This card is a bit worse than Afterburner, depending on the meta, because if the meta is filled with, you know, crazy combo decks making all these monsters, they might not have a set spell or trap, whereas Afterburners can at least always kill a monster, which is something you're gonna see more often. Then again, ladder right now is filled with Eldritch and stuff, so jamming waves might actually be pretty solid there. Next, we have Mech Armor. This card is not the greatest one in here. This says activate this card only if you control no monsters in your main monster zone. We've seen this before. The equipped monster cannot attack directly. It can make a second attack on monsters during each battle phase. If the equipped monster destroys a monster by its attack while you have 3 or more spells in your grave, draw a card. This gives one of your monsters the ability to basically gradually poke at boards, start wiping, and then you start drawing extra cards. So it doesn't come up often, you know, it's very dependent on your opponent's board. That's why it's only played at 1 in this deck, but sometimes you're like, oh cool, and since you have Engage, you can always search for it anyway. There's also another card in the extra that will search for it as well if you need it, but, you know, usually you'll search it with Engage. Now, if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard by a card effect, you can target up to 3 Sky Striker cards in your graveyard, except this one, shuffle them into the deck. This is really solid because let's say you've been playing this grind game, and now suddenly you can start sending back cards like maybe the Engage, you know, if you ran out of recycling, maybe the Kagari, send it back to the extra deck that way, and that way you can also reuse her again together with the Engage and so forth. Next, we have our field spell. This card says you can target one other card you control, excavate the top 3 cards of your deck, and if you do, you can add 1 excavated Sky Striker card to your hand. Also shuffle the rest back. Then, if you excavated a Sky Striker card, send the targeted card to the graveyard. So you're basically trading a 1-for-1, but you get to look at top 3, which is usually really solid in this deck, especially if you can find a Engage this way. If this card in the field zone is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can special summon 1 Sky Striker Ace monster from your deck. So if your opponent tries to interact with this by getting rid of it, you also get a monster on top, which is solid. Next, we have our Multirole. Once per turn, you can target one other card you control, send that card to the graveyard. Also, your opponent cannot activate cards or effects in response to your spell activations for the rest of the turn. However, second skill here. Once per turn, during the end phase, you can set Sky Striker spells with different names from your graveyard up to the number of Sky Striker spells you activated this turn while this card was face up on your field, but banish them when they leave the field. So this means a bunch of the spells that you may have used, you know, during your turn to break your opponent's board or something along those lines, you can now suddenly set them back and maybe use them next turn to interact with whatever your opponent does have for follow-up. So this is very solid, though of course them leaving the field might also hurt you, so you do have to kind of watch out. Next, we have MST. Again, we're getting into those cards where we're like, they're not the most insane, but sometimes they're gonna come up and they're very budget friendly, so this destroys a spell or trap. We kind of already have some of that in Afterburner and jamming waves, but those are, you know, more specific. Maybe you need to start off, you know, by killing some spells or traps to even get to start playing the game. So that way, you know, having an MST is not too bad, though again, this is budget. We want to get rid of a lot of these cards quickly. Next, we have Forbidden Chalice. So once again, this is a negate. We will get to a card that does this usually much better. It is a Sky Striker specific card. But again, we're just trying to fill out the slots with impactful, good, cheap cards here. Then we have Hornet Drones. This card is really solid. This will often be an engage target for you. So this says if you control no monsters in your main monster zone, special summon 1 Sky Striker token in defense, which cannot be tributed. And if you have 3 or more spells in your graveyard when this effect resolves, the token has 1500 attack and defense. So since that is a Sky Striker Ace token, you are able to murder this in order to link into some of your link ones right here, because it is a dark. As you can see right here, it's a warrior dark, so it can turn into a Kagari by itself because it's non-fire. It can turn into a Shizuku by itself because it's a non-water. It can turn into a Hayate by itself because it's a non-wind. And it can turn into a Kaina by itself because it's non-earth. So this is a one card create a cool link. That means if you already have a bunch of spells, let's say in your graveyard, you know, maybe you've had to kill some stuff with a Raigeki, or you use the Rhoda, you use the Forbidden Chalice, maybe you use the Desires, whatever you've done, you have your 3 spells. You can engage. This is kind of like a little combo I'm telling you now. You can engage this incredible card to add the Hornet Drones to your hand. Draw 1 free card, which is already incredible. Activate the Hornet Drones. Get a token. The token gets spit out and you make a Kagari. Her effect activates. She then gets you your engage back to your hand. You activate engage and look for the thing you actually wanted, you know, depending on the situation. Very often it'll be this card, but we'll get to that. And then you get another free draw. That right there is some ridiculously unfair bullshit plussing. It's really good. Again, we have Pot of Desires, so sometimes we'll straight up start banishing these cards and then we feel awful, but when we don't, holy shit, that's nuts. So Hornet Drones, incredible card, limited to 1 for a reason. Next, we have Widow Anchor. So this is limited to 2, again, for a reason. However, in the TCG, it's at 3, because we have engage at 1, so that's our way of balancing it. Though I would love to have this OCG setup instead. It would, in my opinion, make the Sky Striker engine much more viable again. Though people were abusing it in a bunch of decks, and that's why they did it for us that way. Pretty sad. But again, so Sky Striker, Mecha, Widow Anchor. This is the reason that Forbidden Chalice in this deck isn't as impactful always, but still, really solid card regardless. So this says, if you control no monsters in your main monster zone, just like all of them, target 1 face-up effect monster on the field. Negate those effects, and then if you have 3 or more spells in your grave, take control of that monster until the end phase. So this is a change of heart or an original brain control or whatever you want to call it. For any monster, you just steal it. This is incredible to break your opponent's boards. This is incredible to randomly kill your opponent with their own best monsters. This is also a great defensive tool because let's say you just had to set this, you know, you didn't break their board or something like that. It's your opponent's turn. They're now going to OTK you. They're going to slam in with their big guy. You Widow Anchor it in their turn because this is a quick play spell. You steal that monster during the battle phase. You don't die. You get to live, play the game. You have another shot next turn. Widow Anchor is incredible. That's why it is an SR, but yes, we will craft it too. This is way too important to pass up. Next, we will have our Shark Cannon right here. If you control no monster in your main monster zone, target 1 monster in your opponent's graveyard, banish that. So it's kind of like Called by the Grave, but without the negation. You know, sometimes it's good in some matchups to get rid of something that's in their graveyard, though it doesn't come up always. And then if you have 3 or more spells in your graveyard, you can special summon that monster to your field instead, but it cannot attack. So you can basically steal some good stuff, and either you just have it, maybe it has a good effect beyond that, your opponent now doesn't have access to it in their own grave, or you can link it off maybe into more powerful stuff. Now, in our current extra deck we have here, because it's budget, we don't have anything decent to link it off into, so it might be useful to just put in some, you know, commons or rares that are link stuff and do nothing, just so you can link your opponent's stuff away. When we get into the more expensive version of this deck, you will notice how this Shark Cannon actually has a bit more value. Next, we have Torrential Tribute. Again, this is just a solid staple that sometimes wins you games. In the higher end version of the deck, we do not run this, but in here, it's the only thing we can do. And then we have 1 Solemn Judgment, again, because we got it for free and it's still an impactful ultra. Now for the extra deck, we have the most important card, the Kagari. I already explained the effect earlier, but it says if this card is special summoned, you can target 1 Sky Striker spell in your graveyard, add it to your hand. So you basically add something you might want to recycle. In an ideal world, it's an Engage, because then Engage can search for even more stuff. You start drawing even more stuff. Absolutely incredible card, also limited to 1 for that reason. And it also gains 100 attack for each spell in your graveyard. So this way, it might eventually become a really, really big monster and start attacking over stuff as well. Next, we have our Shizuku. It's monsters your opponent controls lose 100 attack or defense for each spell in your grave. So kind of like the opposite of Kagari, also really solid. Once per turn during the end phase, if this card was special summoned this turn, you can add 1 Sky Striker spell from your deck to your hand with a name different from the cards in your graveyard. So if you didn't have an engage, this is often going to give you an engage, but it can also search for other stuff. So this is really solid. Again, it's an SR, so I only have one in the budget list, but it is a solid card that you will want more of as well. Next, we have our Hayate. It can attack directly, and then after the attack, you can send one Sky Striker card from your deck to your graveyard. So this way you start filling up your graveyard with spells as well. Though it doesn't have to be spells, so if you want to set up a Rose or a Ray in order to use their graveyard effects, that's also really solid. Then we have our Kaina. If this card is special summoned, target one face-up monster your opponent controls. It cannot attack until the end of your opponent's turn, and then each time you activate a Sky Striker spell or its effect, gain 100 life points immediately after the card or effect resolves. So this is just a let's slow down our opponent card. Definitely not the most impactful card in this deck, but again, we're trying to be budget, so I just, you know, rammed the extra full of this. Now, I mentioned budget very often, and that's again because this is one of those decks that's just very hard to budgetify. So let me show you the full power version now, and you'll notice it is filled to the brim with ultras. Now, I'm not saying this is the perfect list. In my opinion, it's really solid. You might want to play 3 if you're afraid of your desires banishing both, because if that happens, you can't do a certain play with Celine. I'll get to that later, but so, you know, if you have 3, you might want to play 3. Then our 3 Maxi, broken card, you want to play this. You know, if you have to craft something, it's gonna go into every deck. The only fear, again, is if they hit with some type of different ladder with a different ban list, or they make a ban list altogether, and suddenly a lot of people start playing only that ban list with the TCG, and maybe they don't let us refund the Maxi, whatever, you know. Whatever fear you may have, that's the only big risk about crafting this. But beyond that, you're putting it in almost every deck, and it's a game changer. So yeah. Then we have our 3 Ash, also incredible, stops the Maxi. So another difference is we have a Nibiru. Nibiru stops a lot of the big combo decks out there. Also a hand trap. Also pretty generic, so works in a lot of decks. Then we have Upstart Goblin. Says draw 1 card, then your opponent gains 1000 life points. You might think, huh, what the fuck? I'm gonna make them get 1000 life points. Is that worth it? It is worth it, because this is a spell. So this is just a card that says, get another spell engrave and grab something else from your deck. That is absolutely crucial in this deck. For that reason, the 3 Upstart. You don't really care about the life gain, you just want that 1 draw to get your spell count higher and to draw your more impactful stuff like your Engage. Then we have 1 Terraforming. This adds a field spell from your deck to your hand. So once again, this is just another spell count in your graveyard, and then it replaces itself with your field spell. Next, we have our Pot of Desires that I already showed you. We have our Engage. We have Afterburner. This card is funny. It's a bunch of text, you know, take your time to read it in game. You basically think of this as draw 1 card. That is all it fucking does. Now, if you don't need the draw 1 card, and maybe you don't have a way to kill this by activating your field spell or something like that, you can also just kill it instantly to have 1 more spell in your graveyard. Though very often this will simply be an Upstart Goblin to lead into higher plays, and then ideally you can play this thing on top of it, because they're both field spells. This one will die, and then you have a higher spell count in the graveyard. Another card we have in here is Infinite Impermanence. Very solid hand trap, again very generic. I also saw, I think, Pack play Forbidden Droplets over this, which is another really good spell, so maybe that's something you're interested in. I'm definitely not against that. He's a really good player, so you should probably trust him as well. Then we have our Halke Fibrax in here, another ultra rare. So this card is made with any monster and also a tuner. So tuners are Veiler and Ash right here. So basically any of your monsters with a normal summoned Ash or Veiler, and then this guy is already a Link 2. He summons out another tuner, which will be your Veiler. Then you link those off, so Veiler plus Halke Fibrax links into a new Link 3, Celine, and then Celine uses her skill if you have 3 spells in graveyard, which hopefully you do because it's Sky Striker, to then special summon back your Veiler. So then you link off your Veiler and your Celine to make an access code, which is an incredible link to destroy people, or a Boral Sword. Again, also really good for OTKing. So that's why Halke Fibrax is in this deck. Just the fact you can just have any card, plus a normal summoned hand trap, turns into an instant Boral Sorter access code. This is often enough to just OTK people out of the game. Next, we have our Hita. This one asks 2 monsters, including a fire, so you can make that because you run Kagari. Next, we have Zeke, another solid SR. Must be link summoned. You can only special summon Sky Striker a Zeke once per turn. If this card is link summoned, target 1 face-up monster on the field. Banish it until your opponent's next end phase, so it's basically removal. And then once per turn, target 1 other card you control. This card gains 1000 attack, then send the targeted card to the graveyard. Solid removal right there. Then we have the Selene I just spoke of. Literally, this is just part to make your Link Force. And then the Link Force are Boral Sword, another Ultra. Really good for OTKing, and an access code, another Ultra, really solid for breaking boards and then OTKing as well. So as you can see, the amount of Ultras in this deck, recounting it's 28, I might be blind now, whatever. As you can see, a lot of Ultras, so definitely not the most budget friendly. Luckily, a lot of the Ultras are generic, a lot of the Ultras you are gonna play in other decks, the Veilers, the Maxi, the Ash, maybe the Upstart, maybe the Nibiru, definitely the Halka Fibrax, definitely the Boral Sword, definitely access code, definitely the Impermanences, or Droplets if you want to play Droplets over that. So a bunch of shit you can play in other decks, but still, it's a lot. And a lot of Sky Striker's power comes from the fact that you have access to all these other powerful cards. Because by itself, it's more so an engine than an archetype. So yeah, hope you found this interesting. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you soon. Ciao.